Named after a graceful bird, Shag Harbor is a fishing village of about 400 people at the southern tip of Nova Scotia. The town may seem quaint and quiet, but it's rich with myths and legends. Locals have long heard tales of ghost ships and sea serpents. Perhaps it's not so surprising then that Shag Harbor would be transformed by an eerie and unexplainable presence. It emerged not from the seas though, but from the skies. The night of Wednesday, October 4th, 1967 was clear and cold, and around 11 p.m. about a dozen people in or near Shag Harbor glimpsed a strange sight. As they would later report to the authorities, they noticed a row of orange or yellowish blinking lights falling from the sky. Some of those individuals heard a whistling sound as well. In addition, some of the people who saw this UFO claimed that after it descended, it hovered briefly above the sound, a nearby body of water. Then, the object fell into the water. One of these UFO witnesses was teenager Lori Wickens. Lori and 4 friends were driving on Highway 3 shortly after 11 p.m. that night, and suddenly, one of the group pointed upwards. 4 yellow lights flashing sequentially were descending at a 45-degree angle. Lori and his friends thought they heard a splash. They drove toward the shore to get a better look. And there was the strange object floating about a mile away from them. Only one yellow light was visible now, and it had dimmed significantly. Lori's group believed that an airplane had just crashed, and they rushed to alert the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the Mounties. Of course, in that pre-smartphone era, they needed a payphone. Therefore, they ran back to Lori's car, and he sped off toward Woods Harbor, a nearby village. Lori knew the location of a payphone there. At the payphone, Lori called the Mounties, and Police Corporal Victor Werbitsky answered. Skeptical, the corporal asked Lori if he was sober when he saw the lights, and Lori answered yes. Werbitsky then instructed Lori to remain at the phone until he called back. Werbitsky hung up, and his phone rang again. This time, the caller was a woman named Mary Banks in Maggie Garrett's Point, about 4 minutes from Shag Harbor. Mary told Werbitsky that she too had just seen a crash at the sound. After speaking with Mary, Werbitsky got on the phone with 2 constables, Ron Pond and Ron O'Brien. Werbitsky told the 2 Rons to meet him at the Shag Harbor Irish Moss plant close to the water. Interestingly, Constable Pond had seen the flashing lights himself earlier that night when he was driving on Highway 3. Next, Werbitsky fielded 2 more calls about the crash, one from 2 women on Cape Sable Island and another from a man in Bear Point. Finally, he called Lori Wickens back and asked him to return to the Irish Moss plant. After meeting up at the plant, the corporal, the constables, and Lori Wickens headed over to the sound. There, they were joined by Norman Smith, another local teenager, and Wilfred Smith, Norman's father. Earlier that night, Norman's friend, David Kendrick, had been driving Norman and their respective girlfriends home. Around 11 p.m. on Highway 3, the 4 teens saw the UFO and its flashing lights going downward, heading toward Shag Harbor. Eventually, it disappeared behind a cluster of trees, and the kids all assumed it was a commercial plane. David dropped Norman off at his home and drove away. At his house, Norman again saw the lights in the sky. He decided to wake Wilfred up and show him the sight. Father and son watched the lights as they fell. The object dipped behind a hill until it was no longer visible. Norman and Wilfred believed it was an airliner crashing, and so they jumped into their car and sped to the harbor, expecting to find the site of a disaster. They wanted to help out in any way that they could. At the sound, Wilfred, Norman, Lori, and the law enforcement officials peered out at a single yellow light on the horizon, now almost too dim to see. The group tried to estimate the size of the craft and came up with these measurements: 10 feet tall and 60 feet wide. Then the yellow light vanished altogether. Either it had drifted so far out it could no longer be seen from the shore, or it had sunk into the dark, icy deep. Corporal Werbitsky now sprung into action. He ordered Ron O'Brien to go to a nearby house and report a potential plane crash to Halifax's Rescue Coordination Center. The center would send assistance. And he told Ron Pond to stay on the shore and interview witnesses. By this time, 2 Shag Harbor fishermen were on site, Bradford Shand and, coincidentally, Wilfred's own brother, Lawrence Smith. Werbitsky asked them to take their boats over to the crashed plane. Norman and Werbitsky boarded Shand's boat, and Wilford got on his brother's vessel. At the crash site, the group searched for almost an hour straight, desperately seeking survivors or bodies, but there were none. Instead, they confronted a strange sight, a thick yellowish cluster of foam bubbles, approximately 80 feet wide and half a mile long. On top of that, the air had a strangely sulfurous odor. Soon, Coast Guard Cutter 101 appeared. Ronnie Newell was its captain. Ronnie informed Werbitsky that no planes had crashed that night. Rather, according to the Rescue Coordination Center, every commercial, private, and military aircraft in northeastern Canada and New England was listed as safe and sound. At this point, several other boats were in the water, near the spot where the UFO had crashed, and after an hour, the yellow foam bubbles vanished. Finally, at 3 a.m., the search ended for the night. The next day, October 5th, the Rescue Coordination Center filed an official incident report. It stated that an object of unknown origin had fallen into the water by Shag Harbor. Once the Canadian Forces headquarters in Ottawa received that report, it sent the HMCS Granby to the spot to continue the search. The search earned significant coverage in the local media, particularly in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald. On October 7th, that newspaper ran an in-depth article with a tantalizing headline, "Could be something concrete in Shag Harbor, UFO, RCAF." The RCAF is the Royal Canadian Air Force. The Canadian Forces continued scouring the area until October 9th, the following Monday. Divers scrutinized the bottom of the sound, but found nothing to indicate a crash of any kind. And to this day, no physical UFO evidence has been recovered from Shag Harbor. When the search ended, the Shag Harbor UFO story largely dissipated, much like that yellow foam in the sound. Indeed, over the next 25 years, the incident was rarely discussed in the media, and relatively few people outside the region were familiar with this tale. In 1993, however, all of that changed. On the night of October 4th, 1967, in the town of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, an impressionable 12-year-old named Chris Stiles was gazing out his bedroom window. And then he saw something that would forever linger in his memory, forever change his life. A row of yellow lights, an actual UFO, was descending from on high. From that moment on, Chris was devoted to the study of otherworldly contact. In fact, when he grew up, Chris joined the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, a nonprofit organization based in Cincinnati. Since its founding in 1969, MUFON has conducted extensive UFO investigations. In 1993, Chris and Don Ledger, another MUFON member, interviewed as many Shag Harbor UFO witnesses as they could find, civilians, divers, military officials, and law enforcement officers alike. They actually learned many of the names simply by reading old newspaper stories. The eyewitness testimony that Chris and Doug gathered helped them piece together an explanation of those bizarre events, and their 1993 book, Dark Object, the World's Only Government-Documented UFO Crash, explains their thesis, which goes like this. Shortly after 11 p.m. on October 4th, 1967, a UFO from space fell into the Sound at Shag Harbor. It then traveled underwater to a cape in Nova Scotia called Government Point, about 25 miles away. At last, the UFO stopped near the Canadian Forces Station, CFS Shelburne, which was a military station at the time. Ostensibly, the CFS Shelburne was conducting ocean research, but its true purpose was to monitor Cold War submarines. In any event, people at the CFS Shelburne spotted this UFO. Actually, since it was no longer flying but was instead submerged in water, it was an unidentified submersible object, or USO. The Canadian Forces sent a group of naval vessels to wait in the water above this craft until a salvage operation could begin. Here's where the story gets really bizarre. Within a couple of days, another unidentified craft appeared near the first one. Chris and Doug believe that this second UFO, or USO, was sent from space by the same aliens who sent the first one. The second craft was intended to help the distressed first one. According to the book, the Canadian Forces monitored both USOs for several more days. Then, all of a sudden, the two unidentified crafts started speeding toward the Gulf of Maine, where they both leapt from the water and shot up towards the sky. At last, they return to whence they came, wherever that might be. Other than anonymous eyewitness accounts, though, no evidence exists to back up the outlandish claims in Dark Object. Supposedly, the people who were interviewed for the book declined to identify themselves as they were afraid of being shamed, or in the case of military personnel, were afraid of losing their pensions. For sure, Dark Object reignited public interest in the Shag Harbor UFO case. These days, the region is home to a UFO museum, and the Shag Harbor UFO Festival brings thousands of visitors to the area each year. At one point, the Royal Canadian Mint even put out a Shag Harbor UFO coin. Still, the question remains, what actually happened in Shag Harbor on October 4, 1967? Some UFO enthusiasts have posited that a secret and experimental military aircraft crashed there. However, it's extremely unlikely that any military agency would fly such an object where civilians could see it. Another theory is that the UFO was a Russian spaceship, but no evidence supports that idea either. Could those flashing lights have been fireball meteors or distress flares, perhaps a group of flares that were launched accidentally? Those theories are certainly more plausible, but they wouldn't account for that yellow foam in the water. It's possible, though, that the foam and the lights were unrelated, a sort of cosmic coincidence. Whatever occurred in Shag Harbor on that fateful night, the event's aftermath proves at least one thing. The notion of extraterrestrial contact has a powerful hold on the human imagination. Whether in Nova Scotia or elsewhere, many of us would love to believe that our alien comrades have paid us an otherworldly visit